Hello and welcome to Hope from the Hood, the Peaceful City, a brand new podcast brought to you by Shonda Jha, Director of the Oakland Peace Center. Each week, our hope is to bring you inspiring stories of people and organizations creating peace in their communities, starting with partners of the Oakland Peace Center. This week, we will be featuring the East Point Peace Academy and Kazu Haga. Sit back and prepare to be inspired. So this is Shonda Jha, and I'm sitting here with Kazu Haga, who is the director of the East Point Peace Academy, interviewing him for our very first podcast. And I wanted to start out with a really basic question, which is, tell me the name of your organization and how long it has existed.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. The East Point Peace Academy, as an organization, started in October of last year, so we're still pretty new.
Yeah.
And it comes out of the idea that, the military trains many of its top leaders at the military academy at West Point, and, we believe that we're only going to have peace in our society if we invest as much into peace as the military invests into war.
Mm-hmm.
And so the East Point Peace Academy is an effort to kind of reverse the investments that we're making into violence by investing in training our leaders in the peace movement.
Amen. So you've already talked about why you're doing what you're doing, but in one sentence, what is it that the East Point Peace Academy does?
In one sentence, we are trying to foster beloved community through the practice of nonviolence and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King.
Wow.
If that wasn't a run-on.
Way to cover your bases. And you've been involved in this work for quite a while. What was the moment that made you realize you needed to be a part of the work that you're doing now?
Well, I think there's actually two moments for me. One was when I got into this work on a broad level, was when I was 17 years old, and at the time I had dropped out of high school and I was not doing anything productive with my life and in and out of trouble. And I heard about a group of people that were going to walk from Massachusetts to New Orleans and then down the coast of Africa to retrace the slave route and to talk about the legacy of slavery and how it still impacts this country and to begin the process of healing and reconciling from that legacy. And just, I heard about this pilgrimage a week or so before it started, and on a whim I decided to check it out for a week. And I remember on the third day on the walk just feeling like this was the place that I was meant to be, and so I didn't come home for a year and a half after that, essentially.
Wow.
And this walk was initiated by a Japanese Buddhist order who was really committed to peace and justice work, so I ended up spending a year and a half living with them, and that's how I was introduced to social justice work on a broad level. But the work that I do now is it's specific to Dr. King's legacy and this training curriculum called Kingian Nonviolence. Yeah. And that, to me, came about. I took a 2-day workshop in this philosophy in November of 2008. And it was a cool workshop. I loved it. I was thinking about it a lot. And then just a few months after that workshop, Oscar Grant was shot. And, for anyone in Oakland, everyone knows who Oscar Grant was. He was a young African-American father who was shot and killed by the transit police out here on New Year's morning in 2009. And I ended up on the steering committee of the coalition that came together.
Yeah.
And we were doing the mobilizations and organizing afterwards. And that was the first time that I first of all, it was one of the most powerful movements I've ever been a part of. Just the power and the emotion and the rawness of it. And at the same time, it was, from my perspective, a movement that was so grounded in anger. which is a tough thing for movements because it's, on the one hand, that anger is righteous, and we need to be angry about injustices like this.
Yeah.
And at the same time, really seeing for the first time that anger is not a sustainable force that can continue to motivate movements. That anger, righteous indignation that King talked about, can spark movements, but it can't sustain them.
Yeah.
And that we need to be sustained by something that is larger than that. And so I found myself in that movement trying to advocate for nonviolence, but couldn't articulate it because I had just taken this 2-day workshop. It was cool, but that was it. And so that summer I went and got trained in nonviolence, and have been doing that work since, and really have come to understand that when Dr. King said that nonviolence isn't just a refusal to shoot your opponents, but it's a refusal to hate your opponents, and how we build movements that are grounded, that honors our anger and honors our indignation, but is motivated by some larger force.
Do you find that can be a hard sell sometimes?
It can be a hard sell often. I mean, I live in Oakland,
Yeah.
And I think part of it is because we don't have safe spaces where pain and anger is honored.
Right.
And so if pain and anger, which is, again, it's righteous, people are righteous to be angry, but if we don't find safe spaces for that pain to be honored, then it's going to pour out into the streets, whether it's at a demonstration or through street violence.
Yeah.
And so, it's hard, but I think we have to, as a community, find safe spaces for people to heal.
Absolutely. Thank you. So, kind of as a follow-up to that question about the moment you realized you needed to be a part of this work, what is it that called you into being in this community in particular? And for East Point Peace Academy, that's kind of a two-part question. It's why in Oakland and the Bay Area, and also why in the prisons, if you're willing to talk about both of those things.
Absolutely. Oakland, I love Oakland, and I think everyone that lives here, one of the things I love about Oakland is people have so much pride in Oakland.
Yeah.
It's a really special place, and a really unique place. There's a guy named Marcus Raskin that once said that the opportunity for revolutionary change happens in the blink of an eye, and if you miss that moment, it's gone. And I feel like living in Oakland, those moments come around every few years.
Yeah.
Whether it was through the Oscar Grant movement or what happened with Occupy here, and just the long legacy of organizing. And this place has so many challenges, and at the same time, so much potential. The people who are doing real work in these communities are really invested in these communities, and I think there's so much opportunity here. But also, we work a lot. East Point, we kind of articulate our work as being in 3 different communities, and that's with the incarcerated community, with young people, and with activist communities, and community leaders. And I think one of my biggest passions is to work with incarcerated communities. I was just in the jails earlier today doing nonviolence work because I believe that, and I tell these men and the women in the system that if the culture of violence in their communities is ever going to shift, it's not because some researchers from some university or some politicians or some big funder comes down into their communities and starts doing work, but it's because they take it upon themselves to change their own communities. And so for me to be a part of a process where, I get to play some small role in empowering the people who are really going to lead the change is a really humbling thing. And I think, it's a great place to recruit peace warriors because who understands the impact that violence has had on our communities better than the men and the women in our prison system?
Absolutely. You had mentioned something just a minute ago about the great and rich potential of the city of Oakland. One of my colleagues recently kind of posed the question. She said she hears that phrase a lot, the great potential of Oakland, and she asked, what would that look like if it were actualized?
I think the first thing that comes to mind is I remember the day that we had the general strike during Occupy Oakland. And I remember there being more people in the streets of Oakland that day than I have ever witnessed during the 4th of July or New Year's or any sort of official celebration.
Yeah.
And I think, I had a friend that was visiting a lot during Occupy, and when we have marches and demonstrations at Occupy Oakland, he was just so amazed at the fact that people would just take over the streets and we wouldn't have permits, and coming from where he was coming from, he wasn't used to seeing that. And I think the ownership that people in Oakland have over our communities and our struggles is really empowering to see. And, I remember during the early days of Occupy that we saw, like, the encampment, which I think, towards later on, it became, there were a lot of challenges there, but at the beginning, it was really a vision of the world that we want to create, and we were showing people that. Yeah. And I think being in a place like Oakland, you see small examples of what success would look like all the time, whether it's, all the great work that's happening out of the Eastside Cultural Center or the Oakland Peace Center, and all these communities that are coming together. What's happening at Nafsi Ajami, which is an urban farm where people live in yurts and have goats and pigs, and right in the middle of Oakland, and to be able to see small examples of what the world is going to look like is a really inspiring place to work.
Absolutely. And you don't have to answer this one if you don't want to. Okay. But you had mentioned Occupy Oakland, and I was wondering, you were talking about the early days of Occupy, and there was, in that encampment, right, there was the interfaith tent, and there was the children's community, and there were really intentional efforts at bringing diverse people together to hear each other's stories. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts about what could have made that movement more sustainable?
I have a lot of thoughts. We could have a whole other podcast on this. I mean, I think part of it was, like we were just talking about, at the very beginning of the encampment was the vision. And I think movements, the most powerful movements are guided by a great vision. Yeah. And I think we lost sight of the vision. I think we got so caught up in the fight that we forgot what we were fighting for. And, I've been part of many movements that it sometimes feel like the fight is the most important thing. Yeah. And the protest is the most important thing, and the struggle is the most important thing. And all of those things are important, but those are a means to an end. And I think we lost sight of what it was that we were fighting for. And I think because of that, we weren't able to build long-term strategy in the movement. Yeah. I think, one of the things that I was saying a lot is that a lot of the internal conflicts in Occupy was over this discussion over nonviolence and diversity of tactics and this and that. And what I kept saying was that, we're having these arguments over tactics. And we haven't agreed on what the goal was and what the vision was. Wow. And tactics are something you use to accomplish a goal. So if we haven't agreed on what the goal was, then why are we arguing over tactics? And I feel like if we started having a conversation about what the goal was, I feel like nonviolent activists, people of faith, anarchists, we could all come together, and if we all shared the vision of the world that we want to create, I'm convinced that it all would look very similar. And I think if we had been able to be more intentional about having that conversation, I think it would have been easier for us to have the conversation about tactics, because we have a baseline level of understanding and agreement about what it is we're fighting for. Right. And I think that conversation was lacking. Right. So I think that was one of the major things. Interesting. Is there anything from the Occupy movement that you think we should be keeping alive in the work of creating peace? Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think, a lot of people say Occupy is dead and Occupy failed and all that, and yeah, like it didn't, bring down capitalism or anything. But, I mean, a lot of things, I think, first of all, it brought, obviously, so many people into movements. And I think it pushed the envelope as far as what people were willing to do. And tactics that were once considered too militant or too radical, people are using on a regular basis now, whether it's building occupations or marching without permits and things like that. And I think it's really important because, we're at a point in our society where, minor reforms just aren't cutting it. We need radical change, the type of change that Dr. King was really fighting for towards the end of his life. Yeah. So I think, our willingness to use escalated tactics and our ability as a society to discuss fundamental change, radical change, and that not be a taboo thing, I think is really important and is part of the living legacy of that movement.
Oh, thank you. So, we've used the word peace a few times at this point. How do you personally define peace? How does East Point Peace Academy define peace? And how are you organizationally creating peace?
So people who have come to our workshops have heard this story, but during the civil rights movement, there was a young woman named Autherine Lucy, who was the first black student enrolled in the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. And the first day she was on campus, there was a lot of conflict and a lot of tension and a lot of violence, and it was not a peaceful environment. People were throwing rocks at her and breaking windows. And so the school responded by expelling her. They threw her out, Autherine Lucy. And they said she was causing a threat to the security of the school, and so she needed to leave. And the next day, the rioting had died down. And the local newspaper ran a headline that said, Autherine Lucy expelled, there is now peace on the campus of Tuscaloosa. And they wrote that there was peace because the riots had stopped. And it's this understanding, this misunderstanding of peace that I think a lot of people, when they hear that word, they think it's just about the lack of something. And Dr. King gave a sermon in response to that incident called When Peace Becomes Obnoxious, and he called that situation at that campus a negative peace.
Yeah.
That it was a peace that came at the expense of justice for Autherine Lucy.
Yeah.
And that is not a real peace. It's just that the violence has been suppressed by the use of unjust means.
Yeah.
And so I think it's that understanding of peace that allows us to oftentimes justify going to war to create peace, or using incarceration to create peace. Like if we just lock up all those people, then we'll have peace. If we just kill all those people, then we'll have peace.
And that's peace in quotation marks.
Exactly. It's negative peace, and it hasn't worked. We've been trying that for thousands of years, and it doesn't work. And so for us, peace is not just the absence of violence, but the presence of justice, which is what Dr. King taught us.
Right.
So, yeah, there's a lot of violence that happens in the streets of Oakland, and a lot of that is perpetrated by our own community members. And what does it mean for those community members to receive justice? Because when we talk about justice, it has to be justice for all people. Yeah. So, we talk about no peace, no justice all the time. It gets chanted at rallies and things. But I think that's what it really means, is to really ask the question of what justice looks like for all parties involved in a conflict.
Yeah. And what's interesting about that is we may be wrestling with it in new ways today, but that's something that all of our traditions have been pointing out for thousands of years, right? Dr. King was hearkening back to something from the Hebrew Scriptures where the people of Israel are saying, where are you when we need you? And God says, you keep saying peace, peace, when there's no peace, because you're oppressing your workers, because you are leaving the poor in poverty. And many, many ancient traditions point to that same tension.
Yeah, I think there's just certain universal truths that, regardless of the cultural perspective that you come from, there's something there. Yeah. Absolutely.
Amazing. So, what is a distinctive value of your organization, and how do you practice it? And I won't lie, when I was pulling together the questions for this afternoon, I was thinking in particular of East Point Peace Academy's commitment to a gift economy as part of the way you manifest your values. So it's not just teaching certain principles, but living certain principles. And that was one of the ones that sprang to mind for me.
Yeah, we have a list of 10 core organizational values that we try to live by, and we think that it's an attempt to try to be different than every other nonprofit that's out there, because I think, Oakland's problem is not a lack of nonprofits. We got plenty of nonprofits. That's not cutting it for us, so we want to try to do things differently. Yeah. And, as far as the gift economics thing, I have to give a shout out to the East Bay Meditation Center, who's really been our inspiration for this model, and specifically a guy named David Folke, who's done a lot of work in developing the principles. But for us, we all of our work is offered on a gift economics model, which means that we've never charged a fee for anybody to do this work. And part of it is because we want to make sure that our work is accessible, that we never want money to be an issue of why people can't participate in our work, and we work with a lot of communities who can't pay. But another part is that we want to use this as an opportunity to change the paradigm of how we view things like money and wealth and value and things like that. And so we're really committed to, our fundraising efforts is an opportunity for us to talk about money and to talk about how this market model this market system of economics is not working for us, and that there's a different way to do things, and there's a way that our work and our lives can be supported by our communities, by the generosity of our communities, and not by this market system. So, we look intentionally at money. I mean, another value that we have is financial transparency, and that means for us, anyone can go on our website and click one button and see exactly how much money I make, see how much the organization makes, what we're spending each penny on, because I think, it's our community that sustains our work, and our community has a right to know where their support is going. So, the little things like that I think we're just trying to work a little bit differently.
Absolutely. And just out of curiosity, just to clarify for anybody who hasn't had a chance to go through one of your trainings, how do you get your work into the world?
Mostly through word of mouth.
Yeah.
We do a lot of workshops in the community. I do a lot of, whether it's short presentations or mini lectures or mini workshops to our full 2-day introductory workshop. Since October, we've trained, or we've presented to over 1,000 people already. And someone will come to a workshop. We got into the San Bruno County jails because we did a community workshop, and someone came who works at the jail and loved the workshop, invited us to come into the jail. Or someone will come to a workshop and they think it'll be a great workshop for their church, and they'll invite us to their church.
Yeah.
So it all spreads through word of mouth.
Nice. And the trainings themselves can look like a couple of hours or a couple of days?
Ideally, it's 2 days.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll do workshops, however long or short as people have time for. But ideally, the introduction workshop is 2 days. It's a full 16 hours. We come from a legacy of people who, trained for almost an entire year before they went to their first protest.
Yeah.
And Gandhi and his 78 followers who lived in an ashram and did self-purification and training for 15 years before embarking on the Salt March. So, East Point Peace Academy, we take training very seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. And the goal, if at the end of one of those trainings, what's the hope that people walk out with? What's your hope for what people walk out with?
Well, I think we recognize that 2 days is a very short time, and it can inspire people, and it can plant seeds, and at the end of the day, it's just 2 days.
Yeah, and I think, at least in my experience, for those of us who went through the 2-day training, at the beginning, 2 days seemed like a lot, and at the end, we realized how little that had been.
Yep, and as facilitators, we always run into that problem,
right?
I mean, there's always so much more that we want to talk about. So I think for us, it's about people gaining an interest, an understanding and a respect about the fact that nonviolence, I talk about nonviolence in comparison to martial arts all the time. Like, you don't take 2 days of a martial arts class and think you're done. It's a lifelong thing, and you get better and better at it each time you practice, and nonviolence is the same way. Just because you get a certificate that says you've attended a 2-day workshop, it doesn't mean you're nonviolent.
Right.
In the same way that you never become Kung Fu. You're always in the practice of becoming a better practitioner of Kung Fu, and it's the same with nonviolence. So I think, giving people a perspective that this is a lifelong practice, and wanting, and getting people to want more, and to take more and more trainings and advance their practice in it.
And helping us learn that it's not just about a strategy that we bring into rallies, but it's about an everyday way of living as well.
Yeah, for us, it's definitely a way of life. I always say that nonviolence isn't a switch you turn on when you go to a protest, and a switch you turn off when you're organizing the protest, or whether when they're in your communities or in your families. For us, like, violence is the issue.
Yeah.
The fact that we continue to justify the use of violence to get what we want is part of the problem.
Yeah.
And whether that's during demonstrations or in movements or in our own families, and I think we have to root that out. Dr. King considered nonviolence to be the antidote to violence.
Yeah.
So, and everywhere we go, we're trying to practice it.
Amen. So, what would this community, and I think by that I mean Oakland, look like that would put you and the East Point Peace Academy out of business?
Well, we're a ways away.
You've got some job security?
Yeah. No, Oakland provides plenty of job security for me. I think part of nonviolence is that it gives us the ability to dream big. I was we were doing a youth training a while ago. Every week we were going into a high school and working with some young people,
Nice.
and at the same time we were going into the jails every week and training the men. And so we were having them communicate with each other. And one of the young people wrote to one of the inmates. He said, I don't think a world without violence is ever possible. But if we can change at least one person, then it's worth the effort. And so it sparked this interesting conversation in the jails about, well, okay, is a world without violence possible? And I kind of come at it with a slightly different perspective, because I think whether or not it's feasible is not the question.
Mm-hmm.
Because whether or not we believe it's feasible, that's the world that we're going to try to create and do as much as we can in our lifetime to get as close to that as possible. And so, what would put East Point out of business, I suppose, is a world where, all conflict, and it can't just be in Oakland, right? But
Right.
a world where conflict has been reconciled, where each new conflict, because we're never going to create a world without conflict. Conflict is universal, but conflict isn't a bad thing. And so a world where each conflict is an opportunity for growth, where each individual, each community has the tools necessary and has been empowered enough to be able to look at conflict as an opportunity and to not allow conflict to escalate into acts of violence, because the violence and conflict are two completely different things.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask if there is anything in particular from your own background, from your growing up, from your cultural heritage, that you think shapes the way you understand the generational aspects of the work, or doing the work whether or not we're actually going to accomplish that long-term vision?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I think when I was young, I had a very contentious upbringing, but my stepfather for a long time was a Native American man, and he introduced us to Native ceremony, and we spent a lot of time on the res every summer. And part of their perspective, a lot of indigenous communities look at that multi-generational approach of the seventh generation. What are we doing in our lifetime that's going to impact 7 generations down the road? But I also, grew up in the East, and I was raised in a Shinto household and spent time in Buddhist communities and things like that, where I feel like there's a sense of, we know what the goal is, we know what we're trying to reach, and at the same time there's a sense of detachment from that.
Right.
That even if we never get there, that's okay, because we're still going to try.
Right.
And so, I grew up with a lot of different cultural influences, and I think there's like we were talking about earlier, I think all cultures have some sense of that sort of multi-generational approach.
Absolutely. If we go back far enough.
Absolutely.
I think part of the challenge is that we've often been distanced from that legacy in all of our cultures.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, how is it that people could help put you out of business, even if we think that may not happen anytime soon?
I think there's a lot of ways. Obviously, we'd love for people to attend our workshops and get involved with our work directly. Things as simple as, we always say that nonviolence isn't about waiting until someone punches you and then figuring out what to do about it.
Right.
Right? It's about, part of our training is about identifying the warning signs that a conflict is escalating and intervening before it escalates to a point where someone is getting hurt. And if you can start to identify those warning signs, sometimes something as simple as a smile or a hug or just acknowledging somebody and seeing them, really seeing them, can keep a conflict from escalating.
Right.
And I think, nonviolence is, people misunderstand nonviolence. People think it's passive, people think it's weak, but nonviolence isn't about not being violent, right? It's not about what you don't do. It's about when you see conflict, when you see injustice, when you see violence, what are you going to do about it?
Right.
So I think by all of us being a little bit more courageous and being willing to step into situations of conflict, whether it's conflict that's happening in your neighborhood or conflict that you see in society, having the courage to step in and to try to bring about beloved community in whatever little or big ways, that's what needs to happen. And I think every single one of us has a responsibility in how we shape our communities. We have an impact in how we shape our communities. So, we're shaping our communities one way or another, whether we like it or not.
Right.
So being more mindful and being more intentional about how we're shaping our lives and our families and our neighborhoods and our communities.
Absolutely. Thank you. And that was one of the questions that I got from several people was, what are some concrete ways that we can be helping this work? So thank you very much for that. So can you share a story of a moment where you felt really hopeful about the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I got a lot of those.
You can share a couple.
This is the great thing about my work is it keeps me faithful, and hopeful. I remember one time I was doing a training at the San Francisco Women's Show, and it was a difficult training because A, the workshops are mandatory, and B, some of the women aren't told that they're participating in this 2-day workshop until like 10 minutes beforehand. They get woken up out of bed. They're like, all right, you got to go to this workshop. So we need to communicate better with the sheriff's department about that. But and the room that we're doing the workshops in is tiny, and people can barely move around. And so all of that creates these really tense environment, especially when we start the morning with people like, this is BS. I don't want to be here.
Right.
And one time, and we didn't know this until much later, but a woman walked into our workshop and saw another woman in the room who was being housed in a different unit because they had just been beefing. And so she said she thought to herself, there's no way that I can sit in this tiny room with this woman for the next 2 days. And apparently, at the end of the first day of our workshop, she felt so inspired by what we were doing that she actually went to the other woman at night and reached out to her and reconciled that conflict. And during the closing circle of our workshop, she told us this story, and these two women embraced in a hug in the middle of the circle. And that was just 2 days. Wow. And it started with like, this is BS, I don't want to be here. And so, I'm always reminded of, like, if we speak about peace with confidence, how quickly cultures can change. And to sustain that change is a lot of work. Like, who knows what happened with those two women after we left? We acknowledge that. Like I said, it's not just a 2-day thing. Yeah. It's a lot of work, but it's not that hard because we all want peace. Like, every single person in the world wants peace in their lives. That's a universal human trait. Yeah. And I think if we can speak to that part of all of us as human beings, it's not that hard to change cultures. Yeah. So.
Thank you. So who or what inspires you to continue doing this work? You've already started to answer that question, but there's usually multiple sources.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is it's like this wheel, right? The work inspires me to keep doing the work. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it is, on a kind of macro level, I suppose, it's the idea that, Kingian nonviolence specifically comes out of a conversation that Dr. King had just hours before he was shot, where he was asking some of his lead advisors to institutionalize and internationalize nonviolence. And so...
Can you say that phrase one more time?
To institutionalize and internationalize nonviolence. He said that as another gentleman, one of my mentors, Dr. Bernard Lafayette, was walking out of his motel room in Memphis. He said, Bernard, the next movement we need to have is to institutionalize and internationalize nonviolence education. And so Dr. Lafayette took that as Dr. King's final marching orders to figure out a way to institutionalize Dr. King's teachings in prisons, in high schools, in communities. And so this work that we do is considered to be the living legacy of that. And, as a Japanese person, as an immigrant, as just this random person in the universe, being part of continuing the legacy of Dr. King and making sure that his legacy remains alive despite his body not being with us anymore is a huge source of inspiration and responsibility,
Yeah.
But also on a micro level, every day that I get to work in the prisons and in the jails and with young people, those are the people that inspire me. Yeah. Like, I read inspiring books all the time by famous people and see their speeches on YouTube and TED, and all that inspires me too. But at the end of the day, to see people who are struggling so much and who have been through so much and who want peace so badly, I think we have this assumption about the people in our criminal justice system just because they're wearing orange jumpsuits that they don't care about peace.
Right.
And that's just not true.
Right.
They want peace as badly as anyone, if not more.
Yeah.
And to see them being inspired by this work and to see them feeling like they have a leadership role in creating this culture of peace that's my inspiration.
Amen. Thank you. So and you've already talked about this a little bit, one concrete thing we should be doing to help create peace. And you had talked about in our neighborhoods in any small way, you had talked about the trainings.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything that you usually encourage people during the trainings to put into practice?
Yeah, not anything in particular, because I believe that we all, like, different things work for different people, but one of the things that we talk a lot about in doing this work is the need to kind of sustain our souls, right? Not just our intellect. One of the principles of nonviolence is avoid internal violence of the spirit as well as external physical violence.
Right.
And so what are we doing in our lives to release the pressure from day-to-day conflicts and the violence that we're surrounded by and the trauma that we hold? Because there's twice as many suicides every year in this country as there are homicides, and that speaks to the deep impact of emotional violence. And so often the emotional violence, it might start externally, but it's reinforced internally. It's something that we do to ourselves. And whether it's burnout, whether it's telling ourselves that we're not good enough, whether it's internalized oppression, whether it's holding on to anger and hatred, as an old saying, it says hating someone is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Yeah. All of those things are acts of violence that we do to ourselves. So what practices do we have in our lives that is helping to release that as part of, this has to be part of the strategy of building nonviolent movements. Self-care is not something that we do on the side, but it's a core part, like in the civil rights movement when they went to church to pray together, when they sang freedom songs together. That was part of the strategy to keep people's spirits lifted. Yeah. And so I think, whether it's meditation or prayer or hanging out with friends or going for a run or whatever it is in our, the practices that work for us in our own lives, we have to find that and make sure that we're sustaining ourselves because, this is multi-generational work, which means we have to be in it at least as long as we're alive. Yeah. So how are we making sure that that's sustainable?
Absolutely. Now, the last question I have written down is what gives you hope for our future as a community? I'd like to rephrase that because that's another one of the crowdsourced questions, right? Yeah. It's one where people said, where can we find hope? Mm-hmm. And so I wonder if you have some advice for signposts of hope for people who are seeking peace but aren't seeing it.
You may have heard me tell this story because I say it a lot. For me, one of the things that I think about a lot, and this ties back to one of our values as an organization too, of looking at long-term strategy and multi-generational strategy. There's a place in India called Meghalaya, and the people in Meghalaya hundreds of years ago figured out a way to build these bridges because during the monsoon season the rivers flood and they can't get to the other side of the bank. So what they started to do was they started to weave the root systems of young sapling trees, and eventually these grow into living bridges that go from one side of the river to the other. And some of them are like double-decker bridges and they're massive bridges. And part of the challenge in building these bridges is that some of them are so big that it actually takes multiple generations to build. And there's a scene in a documentary film that I saw once of an old man who's teaching this young girl, his nephew or his niece, how to tend to these bridges. And he's explaining to her that I'm never going to be able to walk on this bridge, but one day your children will be able to walk on this bridge. And to me, that's such an important parallel for the work that we do because we're not going to see beloved community in our lifetime spread throughout the world. We're not. And we have to just be okay with doing our part and tending to our portion of the bridge and having faith that future generations will be able to reach that other bank. And right now, when we look out into the world, we see small examples of beloved community, and I think it's really important to hold on to those and see what is possible. and also recognize that, you know what, you're right, like we're just tending to our portion of the bridge and we can't see the complete bridge.
Right.
But so much of nonviolence is about having faith that if we tend to our portion of the bridge and that we invest in the next generation so that they know what their portion of the bridge is, that at some point this bridge will be complete and we will be able to see the other side of the bank. And so I think, oftentimes you're right, we don't see examples of peace. And we have to have faith that long term we will be able to get there. And it's hard because there's so much violence that we see today, but so much of nonviolence is about having that humility of letting go and saying, you know what, all we can do is all we can do.
Yeah.
And the next generation is going to do a little bit more, and the next generation is going to do it a little bit more. And if we continue to invest in peace, then the universe will pay us back.
Amen. Kazu, thank you so much. I'm so grateful for you spending this time with us.
Yeah, it was fun. Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. Well, that's it for this week's episode of Hope from the Hood, the Peaceful City. I hope you were as inspired by Kazu and the East Point Peace Academy as I was. For more information about the East Point Peace Academy, please visit www.oaklandpeacecenter.org and visit our partners, where you will find much more information about what's going on with East Point Peace Academy. In the meantime, be peace, be at peace, and may all of our cities soon know peace.